In this lesson, we'll be shaping the terrain model to better suit the house. So we're going to start doing this by first of all cutting a hole into the site mesh just underneath the building, and then we're going to shape the vertices up and down depending on how it needs to lie relative to the building. So we're going to start by creating an outline just around the edge of the building. And I'm going to start by drawing a spline. So just create an ordinary spline. You can make it any color on any layer. It's just going to be a temporary object, and you can just draw it on the inside of the walls where the house edge is. So this I'm going to do quickly by just putting the video on pause, and then I'm going to come back as soon as this entire outline is complete. So here we can see the completed spline around the entire outside. I'm just going to pull it to the side so you can see. It's a single outline that just traces the house. And what we're going to do to that now is extrude it and then boolean it into the site mesh. So let's turn the site mesh back on, isolate those two so that we can work on them independently. And let's now extrude this. 10 meters should be fine, just so that we can clearly see that it is penetrating the entire site mesh, so you can see the whole bottom and the whole top. And we're now going to go to our compound objects, boolean, and let's refine that. Next, you can add an editable poly or just compress it down into an editable poly. So you could also just convert straight down to editable poly. No problem to do that. And now we're going to start selecting the polys that are going to be deleted. So that means all of these, and I'm just doing it as quickly as possible with the paint or with the spray paint tool. And you can see here why it's a good idea to have a low poly mesh to work with, because as soon as you increase the amount of tessellation or the density, it just becomes a lot more troublesome to get all of the edges very neat. So sometimes it's definitely helpful to have a crude low poly mesh, especially when you don't have too much time for your projects. Next, what we're going to do is to move down certain areas that are too high or too low. So to do that, we're going to select the vertex and then scroll down to soft selection and just activate that so that we have a nice fall off from the vertices that we select. So let's check that all of these are selected, and then let's go and manually push them down. Then we can go and select a few more, and this can basically happen pretty much freehand, and you don't really need to go into too much detail. Just basically get the mass correct. So I'm going to do a few more tiny changes, and then most of the rest I will do off camera just before the next lesson. So I think that you pretty much get an idea of what we're doing, and it's basically cut the entire mesh and then refine the rest. So here this mesh will be lowered as well. Right now the planting layer or the site mesh is slightly above this area, as well as this pavement edge. It just needs to be dropped ever so slightly. So we can go down to the editable spline and we can just select these vertices of that spline and just bring it down ever so slightly to go just below the actual pavement level. Same thing will be done here on this separate object, which is our driveway. We need to take these vertices and just pull them up until they reach the edge of the garage. So all of these tiny refinements I will do just before the next lesson. What I do want to touch on though at this point is just to add a few more details into the garden. If we look at the ground landscaping layer, there are a couple of areas such as this that have these sleeper steps in the actual site. And I did notice as well that we have a couple of treads going across the pool. What happens to the pool in this area is that we have, if I just isolate it here, we'll see it clearer, is the pool is a lot shallower at this point, and then just after these steps it becomes much deeper. So let's go ahead and model that into our pool right now. And we're going to go and select all of these edges, right click, connect. Going to shift this across. We can do this purely by eye because we don't actually have the exact location where that becomes deeper. And next we want to add another horizontal line. So let's select one of them and click on ring. Just going to then check that everything is correctly selected. Right click, connect again, and then just shift this higher. Now you can go ahead and delete these back areas. Just hit delete. I'm going to select the two opposite edges and then scroll down to bridge, and I'm going to bridge these two as well. So this has now created a shallow area where the water would ideally be pumped up. It would run down underneath these treads and it would flow into this deep lap pool at this area here. So now let's go to these treads and start to model those, and we're going to continue this path into the garden and in front of those bedrooms. So let's choose the correct layer for this. We can perhaps go down and create a new one called 04 Hardscape for all of the hardscaping elements. And let's go now and create a simple box just underneath one of those, and the depth of that box can be any random depth since we won't necessarily see the bottom. Now we can move it to the right height, so we just want it to be floating just above the water level, and we can now make an instance of that box several times. I'm not sure how many there are, so I'm just going to take a guess. And then the remainder I'm going to move into the garden in top view. I'm just going to move them out till about here. And then in perspective, let's go and drop them down. And we should also figure out how we can now go and raise, or at least create a type of stepping stone scenario so that we can get from the stepping stones in the pool to the stepping stones down below. So this can be done just by adding a few more steps. I just need to go now and raise these, so I'm going to select them all. And in my shaded view, I'm just going to lift them up ever so slightly so that they are just above the water. Next, I'm going to copy this last one. I'm going to lock my selection before I copy it by pressing spacebar. And I'm going to have this one in place, and then perhaps this one over here will be slightly lower. We can lower it down by 150 millimeters, and we can do the same thing now by making another instance of it. Just going to redo that one quickly. Perhaps like this will be easier. And I'm just snapping from corner to corner so that that height difference becomes exactly the same. Now these two are going to be slightly unique, so I'm going to go down to the Make Unique button. I say that I don't want them to be unique with respect to each other. And then the distance of this, I want to basically make it slightly higher. So let's take the editable poly underneath and just shift this down manually, thereby creating a little bit of a wall that is supporting these steps. So this is kind of a way that we can get into the garden. And in this area, we can also perhaps raise the height of the actual mesh itself, just so that it would be easier to access these steps. Here you can see that the site mesh is interfering slightly, so it's a good idea to come in and start to actually move it out of the way, so that you don't actually have that happening. Then these are going to move up. Again, you want to make sure that that height difference is no more than 150 mils. And then this is going to come down to there. And again, you can start to now move your stepping stones in the garden around at any level. And it's sometimes very nice to also just move them slightly out of place so that it looks a little bit more natural. So this you can continue and you can modify it slightly. The distances don't have to be exactly the same so that you do get a slightly more organic feel to it. And this is going to be the way that people cross the pool and move into this garden area, since there is no other way to do it unless you go through the actual bedroom. So this is quite an essential part of the design of the house. And I do as well think that crossing the pool does become quite a feature as you just glide over the water. So these elements can now be copied to this area here. You can move them around backwards and forwards until you get all of that looking correct. Super. So now what we're going to do is move on to the next section in the next lesson where we're going to set up our scene and do a black and white render. And that will then allow us to just set up our lighting. We can then start working on our materials. Later on, we will add all of the 3D plants into our scene. And then right at the end, we will then do our final render preparation. So all of that will be coming up soon. So hang on for it. And I'm looking forward to sharing all of those rendering tips very shortly.